Robert Dennis Blair Adams was a 31-year-old Canadian man living in Surrey, British Columbia. He was a construction worker, and while he had struggled with alcoholism previously, he had been sober for 2 years and regularly attended AA meetings. He had recently begun dating a woman in Germany, having met her whilst working on a construction site in Frankfurt. With his stable job, relationship and sobriety, it seemed like Adams had his life together and was doing well. Then, out of the blue, he began telling his mother and friends that someone was spreading lies about him, and that they were out to kill him. Soon after, without telling anyone his plan, he quit his job, withdrew all of his savings, took his valuables out of his safety deposit box, and headed to the US. Less than a week later, his partially nude body would be found in a parking lot. It was clear that he had been murdered. His cash and other valuables were scattered around him, apparently of no interest to his killer or killers. So, with robbery out of the question, why had he been killed? And why had he fled to the US days prior? Had someone really been out to get him? This is the mysterious story of Blair Adams. Blair's mother described him as kind and ambitious, the kind of man that would go out of his way to help those around him, even strangers. He was a hard worker and was employed at his stepfather's construction company. He often travelled as part of his job, going wherever the company had needed him to. This was how he had met his girlfriend, having worked in Frankfurt in the winter of the previous year. In the weeks before his departure from Canada, his friends and family recalled him acting strange. He stopped attending his AA meetings and seemed to be constantly on edge. This is also when he began to tell them that lies were being spread about him and that somebody was out to kill him. He was extremely paranoid, always looking over his shoulder, as if he felt like he was being followed. When he quit his job, he also left his work site unlocked, which was very unlike him. He never returned for his final paycheck either, which could mean that something had spooked him so badly that he no longer felt safe near the site. On the morning of the 5th of July 1996, he headed to his bank and withdrew most of his savings. He also emptied his safety deposit box, which contained gold bars, platinum and some jewellery. He stuffed the valuables into a small bag and then, without telling anyone, began making plans to leave the country. 2 days later, he boarded a ferry in Victoria, British Columbia, and headed to Seattle, Washington. Border officials, suspicious of the large amounts of cash that Blair was carrying, along with his probably anxious appearance, stopped him for questioning. Due to the amount of cash he had on him, they suspected Blair of being a drug courier, and when asked if he had any prior convictions, he lied, claiming to have a clean record. He had, in fact, been arrested previously on drug and assault charges, and so he was denied entry into the US and sent back to Canada. Undeterred by this setback, Blair simply waited a couple more days and then tried a different approach. This time, he attempted to enter the US on foot, at the Pacific Highway border crossing, but was stopped by Canadian Border Patrol officers. The officers had stopped him because he matched the description of a man that had been involved in a nearby traffic accident. They noted that the man had scratches and cuts on his hands and legs, but otherwise seemed unhurt. Blair denied being involved in the incident, and the officers were forced to let him go as they lacked the evidence to detain him. Determined to get into the US, Blair made his way to the Vancouver International Airport, where he rented a Nissan Altima and then drove to the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Once there, he purchased a round-trip ticket to Frankfurt, Germany. While this was where his girlfriend lived, when asked by investigators later on, she would tell them that Blair had not mentioned coming to visit her. It also seemed strange that he would be so insistent on getting into the US just to fly out to Germany, especially since he had just been at a Canadian airport. Regardless, he booked in for the flight to Germany, but didn't actually get on the plane. Instead, he purchased another ticket, this time heading for Washington DC, and immediately boarded the flight. His reasons for doing this, as with most of this case, are unclear. Perhaps he had been spooked by somebody at the airport, and rather than going with his initial plan, he quickly switched to the next available flight. Or maybe he had always planned to switch flight, hoping to throw off anybody following him. Either way, he arrived in Washington just before 7 AM on the 10th of July, and immediately rented out another car. He climbed into the white Toyota Camry and began driving, and after driving for almost 500 miles, he arrived in Knoxville, Tennessee. At around 5:30 p.m, a man named Gerald Sapp, who was an interstate repair service driver, attended a call out to a gas station at Strawberry Plains Pike. Upon arriving, he was met by Blair, who explained that he couldn't get into his vehicle as the key didn't seem to be working. Now, this was back when car keys worked the exact same way as normal keys, just insert it into the lock and twist, so there was no possibility of a technical error. Blair tried to demonstrate the problem with the key, and Sapp immediately figured out what the issue was. It just wasn't the right key. Blair was attempting to open the Toyota with the key for the Nissan he had left back in Seattle. However, when Sapp pointed this out and asked Blair to check his pockets for the right key, he refused, insisting that the key in his hand was the correct one. Sapp tried to convince Blair to empty his pockets for a while longer, but when it became obvious that he was not going to do so, he gave up. He ended up driving Blair to a nearby hotel and organised for the car to be towed to a repair shop. Once at the hotel, Blair was picked up on CCTV and could be seen pacing around the lobby, repeatedly entering and exiting the building looking uneasy and anxious. It was like he was trying to make the decision on whether to stay there or not. Maybe he felt trapped without a vehicle, or maybe he had somewhere that he needed to be. We have no idea if he intended to stay in Knoxville or if he had simply been driving through to get somewhere else, or even just driving aimlessly with no destination in mind. According to his friends and family, he didn't know anybody in Tennessee, so it is unlikely that it was his final destination, unless he wanted to be somewhere where nobody knew him. Regardless of his original intentions, at around 7 p.m, 40 minutes after he had arrived at the hotel, he finally booked a room, handing $100 to the clerk, still looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to attack him from behind. As the clerk counted out his change, he suddenly walked straight out of the building without saying a word. There is no evidence that he ever entered his hotel room, and it is unclear what his movements were after this moment. A couple of people claim to have seen Blair with another man at the nearby Cracker Barrel restaurant, but CCTV from the area and other witnesses do not seem to corroborate this, and instead seem to point to Blair being alone. Whether he spent the night with someone or not, it is clear that at some point he did come into contact with another person or persons. At around 7:15 the next morning, construction workers began arriving at their job site not far from the Fairfield Inn that Blair had booked into. They were in the process of building another hotel and expected this day to be much the same as any other. However, upon arriving in the parking lot of the site, they made a horrifying discovery. Lay in the middle of the lot was the body of a young man, nude from the waist down and surrounded by cash. It was Blair Adams. Police were called and they began investigating the scene. Blair's shoes lay next to his body, his pants and socks had been removed and were inside out, indicating that they had been taken off by somebody else. His underwear had also been removed, his shirt had been partially opened, and the contents of his pockets lay strewn about the ground. A significant amount of cash, Canadian, American and German notes, had been scattered around his body, and a short distance away, police found the key to the Toyota Camry, the same key that Blair claimed not to have the night before. They also found the small bag containing the gold, platinum and jewellery, along with some receipts and paperwork for the rental cars. Blair's cause of death was ruled to be sepsis due to a rupture in his abdomen. He had also sustained an injury to his forehead, which was likely caused by a blunt object, such as a bat or a crowbar. There is a good chance that the rupture had also been caused by a blow to the stomach by this weapon. Blair's arms and hands were covered in cuts and grazes consistent with defensive wounds, which indicated that he had tried to fight off whoever did this to him. There was a decent chance that the murderer was not alone, since Blair was a fairly large and fit young man, and he would not have made for an easy target. It would have been difficult for a single attacker to escape without leaving any DNA at the scene. Investigators did find a single strand of hair at the scene, clutched in Blair's fist, but this unfortunately doesn't seem to have led anywhere. His death was ruled as a homicide, but while police were able to piece together his movements up until he left the hotel at 7 p.m, his time of death was estimated to be around 3:30 a.m, which leaves between 7 and 8 hours unaccounted for. They were never able to identify any suspects, and as he was killed so close to the highway, it is possible that Blair's killer was simply passing through and not from the area, which would make tracking them virtually impossible. Given the unusual circumstances surrounding Blair's death, there have been several theories as to what happened to him. Some think that he was suffering from some sort of mental illness, which could help to explain his sudden shift in behaviour and the apparent paranoia. Depending on how severe this was, it could also be why he was adamant that he was using the correct key for the Toyota. He may not have even remembered that he had rented the other car. As for how he died, it is possible that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe, in his altered mental state, he had seemed threatening to someone and they had taken their self-defense a step too far. A security guard in the area recalled that he had heard a female-sounding scream at around Blair's time of death. Perhaps Blair had somehow upset a woman and someone had stepped in to protect her, causing the fatal blow in the process. Another theory is that his past had simply caught up with him. As mentioned earlier, Blair had struggled with alcohol and there is some speculation that he was also involved with drugs in the past. Perhaps he owed somebody money, or maybe he'd seen something he shouldn't have. Maybe he withdrew the cash and valuables as a way to barter for his freedom and it hadn't worked. The way his clothing had been pulled inside out and his shirt opened seemed to suggest that someone had been searching for something. A wire, for example, or some sort of incriminating evidence against them. Maybe the killers only intended to rough Blair up a bit to teach him a lesson and had caused more damage than they meant to, leading to them fleeing the scene without bothering to pick up any of the valuables in case they could be tracked. The theory that I find most interesting is that his death was somehow related to his time spent in Germany the previous year. His job there was meant to last for a couple of years, but he actually returned home after just a few months. He didn't get along well with his co-workers there and had in fact mentioned to people that he feared them being violent towards him. Friends would say that he was not the same after he returned from Germany, which brings into question what actually happened while he was over there. Remember the girlfriend? Well, some claim that she may have been around 17 or 18 years old and that her family may not have been happy with them dating due to the 13 to 14 year age gap. Maybe they had threatened him. Maybe the rumours he said people were spreading about him were related to him liking younger women. This could be why he feared violence from the men he worked with, as it isn't difficult to imagine them having a negative reaction to this information if they had found out. This would also explain the lack of interest in the valuables, as this wasn't about money and was instead personal. The removal of his pants and underwear could be seen as a way to humiliate him, and them being inside out was merely a product of how they were removed. Afterwards, the perpetrators could have simply hopped on the highway, never to be seen again. While this seems to paint a decent picture, it does also seem far-fetched to imagine someone tracking Blair all the way from Germany to Tennessee, especially in 1996 when technology was not quite as advanced and accessible as it is today. The killers would have had to physically follow Blair through his multiple attempts to enter the US, from one airport to another, by car and plane, all the way to Knoxville, and then waited until 3:30 AM to confront and ultimately kill him. All of these theories have holes in them, and it is unlikely that the case will ever be solved. Almost all of the questions in this mysterious murder are ultimately left without a definitive answer. However, the story of Blair Adams certainly adds meaning to the saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't after you. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and leave a comment down below with any suggestions for future videos. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again next time.